What most Americans miss after leaving Canada isn't just a place or a thing, it's a way of being. It doesn't hit immediately, not during the first weeks back in the United States when everything feels familiar and fast, but then, in quiet moments at a crowded grocery store, in a honking rush hour lane, while calculating a medical bill that absence becomes undeniable. It's the gentler pace, the quieter tone, and most of all, the culture of calm consideration that lingers in memory like a soft echo from another life. The contrast begins as soon as Americans arrive in Canada. At first, it feels like stepping into a mirrored version of the United States. The roads look the same. The stores have familiar logos. The language is recognizable. But beneath that surface is an atmosphere that moves slower, speaks softer, and behaves with a certain kind of emotional caution. Even city life in Toronto or Vancouver feels unusually balanced. Public spaces hum with activity, yet the volume never quite spikes the way it does south of the border. And in that atmosphere, Americans discover something rare: peace in the public sphere. Conversations unfold with less urgency. Lines form without complaint. The word sorry surfaces not out of guilt, but as a kind of social lubricant smoothing over the friction of daily life. It's everywhere, not performative, but embedded. Even casual interactions are layered with gentleness, a kind of societal empathy that doesn't seek recognition. It's a quiet code of conduct, shaped more by restraint than expression. What stands out most is how deeply this affects the rhythm of daily life. Whether it's waiting patiently in a grocery line or exchanging polite nods with strangers in the street, Canadians collectively create an emotional environment that's less reactive, less performative. For Americans used to social energy that leans louder, quicker, and more expressive, this shift feels at once disorienting and magnetic. The absence of confrontation isn't emptiness, it's balance. Even the cold plays a role in shaping this culture. In Canada, winter is more than weather, it's a lifestyle framework. People don't just dress for the cold. They move through it with preparation, patience, and community instincts. Snowstorms aren't personal inconveniences. They're collective challenges met with quiet resolve. Neighbors shovel each other's driveways without ceremony. Strangers offer help without expecting gratitude. And in that shared entrance, a deeper social thread forms, less visible, but more durable. What Americans often miss, then, isn't a particular moment, but a pattern of life. One that values coexistence over competition. One where time is not always optimized, but sometimes simply lived. In Canada, silence holds meaning. Space is respected. Emotional restraint isn't coldness, it's consideration. And for many Americans who return to a culture that prizes immediacy, assertion, and performance, the adjustment feels jarring. As if the emotional air has thickened, the difference extends into everyday systems. Tipping culture, for example, reflects this social philosophy. In Canada, tipping is expected, but less loaded. It's an act of appreciation, not a test of character. The pressure is softened, the gestures less transactional. The same applies to conversations about money, where modesty often replaces showmanship. Flashy success signals are not just rarefaire frowned upon. Respect is measured in presence, not possessions, but the single thread that seems to tie everything together. One thing Americans consistently carry with them after leaving is the feeling of being surrounded by unspoken decency. It isn't loud, it isn't obvious, but it's everywhere. In how people move, speak, and help. In how society structures itself around shared responsibility, not just individual freedom. In how kindness is expected, not celebrated. And when that vanishes, when the backdrop of everyday life returns to competition and commentary, that absence is felt, not as nostalgia, as loss. That sense of loss deepens in the smallest, most ordinary moments. Sitting in a packed cafe where the music blares just loud enough to drown out thought. Watching a cashier mechanically scan items without meeting anyone's eyes. Navigating a four-way stop where everyone seems to be asserting, not yielding. None of it feels wrong, exactly. It just feels louder, sharper, like the edges of daily life have been sanded off in Canada and returned jagged in contrast. Americans who've lived even briefly in Canada often describe a transformation in their emotional reflexes. They notice themselves pausing before speaking, apologizing more often, giving space in crowded elevators or public transit, not out of fear or politeness for show, but because that's what was modeled around them. In Canada, small habits build a social architecture where no one tries to dominate a shared space, and once internalized, those habits don't easily disappear. Even the structure of time operates differently. In many American cities, the pressure to do more is embedded into every hour. Work bleeds into evenings, errands become races, conversations compete with screens. But in Canada, weekends tend to mean actual rest. Offices close earlier, statutory holidays slow cities down, and there's a cultural acceptance, if not expectation, that people take breaks, go outside, spend time at cottages, or simply disconnect. Life doesn't revolve around efficiency alone. It makes space for rhythm, for quiet, for breathing. Many Americans returning home find themselves trying to preserve those rhythms, taking slower lunches, resisting the urge to multitask, seeking silence in a culture that often mistakes it for emptiness. But it's hard. The systems around them pull in the opposite direction, and what once felt like an upgrade begins to feel like a memory that doesn't quite fit anymore. Healthcare is another anchor in that emotional shift. In Canada, the knowledge that a medical emergency won't spiral into financial crisis changes how people engage with risk, sickness, and even time off. There's a deeper trust in the system even when wait times are long or frustrations exist. It offers psychological breathing room that many Americans don't realize they've been missing until they experience it. Returning to a system where illness can become debt reignites a background hum of anxiety they'd almost forgotten. But perhaps the most profound difference lies in how community shows itself. In the US, independence is celebrated with intensity. Success is individual. Space is personal. Help, when offered, often comes with disclaimers or expectations. In Canada, support flows more organically. Strangers hold doors longer. Neighbors shovel each other's snow not for praise, but because it's what you do. Co-workers quietly offer tips for winter tires, or share their go-to remedies for the flu. It's not loud. It's not performative. It's woven into the daily choreography of life. And when Americans return home, they often find themselves looking for that choreography, waiting for it, hoping a stranger might offer unsolicited help, or that a crowded room still feel emotionally spacious. But those rhythms don't always exist outside of Canada. The choreography shifts back to something more fragment where kindness often has to announce itself to be seen. It's in these micro moments that the ache appears, not for a city or a climate or even a lifestyle, but for an emotional atmosphere, for the quiet steadiness of people who don't need to prove they care, for a culture where balance is baked into the architecture of life, not bolted on as a luxury. And that ache, Americans say, doesn't go away quickly. It lingers, sometimes for years. What they miss, in the end, is not just Canadian culture but the version of themselves that Canadian culture allowed to surface. A self that could breathe without urgency, connect without competition, move through the day without bracing for impact. A self that felt, perhaps for the first time, quietly at home in the world. For many Americans, leaving Canada means more than crossing a border. It means leaving behind a version of life that felt softer, more humane. Not because Canada is perfect, but because it invites a different emotional posturion built on patience, modesty, and shared space. The systems are quieter, the people more restrained, but through that restraint flows a steady undercurrent of trust. And so, what Americans miss most isn't a city or a brand of coffee. It's the feeling of walking through a culture that assumes people will be kind, that expects decency, rather than rewarding dominance. It's the quiet confidence that life can move slower and still be full, that success can look like balance, not burnout. That trust, once felt, changes how you move through the world, because once you've lived in a place where calm is normal, it becomes hard to unlearn. And that's what stays with you long after the snow melts, the politeness fades into memory, and the signs return to one language. A sense of what life could feel like if the volume stayed low, and the kindness stayed constant.